Welcome back to the Belonging at Work Summit. Our next guest is a friend, colleague, and fellow DEI champion, Rebecca Channer. Rebecca is the founder and CEO of Prosper City, a business born from her imagination in response to growing evidence that pay discrimination and disparity still exist in most workplaces. Having endured adversity, trauma, and significant stress during her childhood and young adult years, Rebecca funneled these early learning opportunities into her work as an advocate, activist, teacher, manager, director, and eventual social entrepreneur. She believes that resilience is the secret ingredient that increases the surface area of one's heart. Rebecca's company has a bold vision. They are on a mission to end salary discrimination, close the gender wage gap, and diversify workplace teams to ensure that the future of work is built by humans for humans. I couldn't imagine a better guest than Rebecca to help us envision what the workplace could look like if more organizations embrace the concept of compensation transparency. And I'm thrilled to dive deeper into the topic with her. So during our conversation today, I'll be asking Rebecca to share a little bit more about what compensation transparency is, why it matters to the future of work, and how businesses can achieve it, and what role it plays to cultivate a sense of belonging. So together, I know that we will gain valuable insights and inspiration to apply some of the everyday strategies we can take to prepare for the future of work. Okay, Rebecca, welcome to the summit. Super excited that you're here. I know that we're going to have a really rich conversation about this topic. So to kick us off, I'd really love for you to frame the conversation by sharing your working definitions of compensation and pay transparency. So are these concepts one and the same? And if not, what are some of the important distinctions that we should be mindful of as we continue in the conversation?
Sure. Big questions to start off here with. Yeah. Thanks, Rhodes. I so enjoy speaking with you, and I'm so glad to be here. Pay transparency and compensation transparency. Yes, big topics for sure. There's lots of different ways organizations and companies work toward these things. Pay transparency for me is being very open about what different roles within an organization and company are being paid. So there's salary ranges that are often offered or very specific salary points. And organizations, the pay piece is one part of a compensation package, right? So we're seeing more and more as organizations and companies are evolving, and as employees and job seekers are evolving their interests in what matters to them in work, that compensation is a much bigger conversation than just pay. And so we're talking about benefits, we're talking about flexibility, we're talking about PTO, we're talking about whether there's a gym in the office or down the way, different mental health support, certainly how broad is your health insurance and your package, what does it all include, what does it encompass, what does it look like to have maternity or paternity or other parent leave. So those are all the things to me that make up, that's actually just a beginning list really of what can make up a full compensation package. Pay is one piece of that, right? The actual money that you get to take home to pay your bills with, and to create the quality of life that you want. And so those are the two pieces, right?
Yeah, and that's super helpful because I think that when we think about a job, like our attention goes to the salary component, and there's so much more than that. So I think for the purposes of the interview, we're going to stick to compensation because I really like that kind of holistic approach of you're showing up, giving your genius and your best, in theory, into your workplace every day. And so clearly you're good for the organization. How are they good for you, right? And so compensation definitely helps us frame this. So with that, why does compensation transparency matter with respect to an organization's diversity, equity, and inclusion commitment? So I guess first, what is compensation transparency? And then how does that fit into kind of creating a more inclusive workplace where we feel a sense of belonging?
Sure. I mean, so the most common, I would say, the request that I get from different companies and organizations and HR teams that I work with is that, or the desire, right, is to have a more diverse pool of employees, like a more diverse workforce. And, there's enough data out there at this point, enough articles, enough research that says the more diverse teams are more productive, create a better bottom line for the company. But also I like to think just create a better culture and environment where people are happier, and that all matters too. And so, to be able to be more transparent about what the company can offer a human to show up and really bring their best self to work every day, like that starts on day one, right? So in my opinion, we often get 3 interviews down the road in the hiring process before we start talking about compensation. And I actually think that to be able to truly attract a candidate who's really serious about the work, passionate about the mission, but also understands that they have a home, right, to keep afloat, and they have real world support aspects, requirements in their life, a family, whatever it is that they're needing actual compensation and pay for. That piece is just as important. I mean, especially in the nonprofit sector, right? We are like, just live on passion, live on mission. Money doesn't matter here because we don't have any of it to give you, so just pretend you don't need it. And that just is not a functional way to sustain an organization. It's not a good way to keep people engaged in your organization. It's why we have burnout. It's why we start the employee and employer relationship so often off on a note of mistrust, right, or of not knowing, or we have to settle for this. And so being transparent about the compensation, I assert from day one. So you put that job posting, that opportunity up, you advertise it on a website or through word of mouth even, or through email, like go ahead and put that compensation information, and not just the salary, right? Just to your point, a lot of folks say this is the salary or this is the salary range plus full benefits package. My advice is always like, detail that out. Let that be a full page of your job description is what all of those different benefits actually mean to people. Because if you're looking to attract people who I would say systemically have perhaps not had the same opportunities or have felt concerned about discrimination in the workplace, those people are reading those job descriptions more carefully. They want to get a sense of your culture before they even apply. They want to know that you're not coming at this through a veil of secrecy or trying to hide something or trying to take advantage of them, because they've been putting up with that their whole lives already. And so to me, if you want those people, you want the diverse group of people, you want the people who really care about the culture and who are going to therefore add to your culture in a really positive way, you've got to start that foot. You've got to start out on the right foot, which for me is being as open as you can. We use the word transparency. I feel like it causes an allergic reaction sometimes for people, that specific term. But for me, it's just being about truthful. It's being open. It's being honest. It's being inviting. It's being inclusive. And it is like sending that first direct message to people that you will belong here exactly as you are, who you are, and how you show up. And we want that.
I love that. I love that. And so you had mentioned the nonprofit sector. So it sounds like you have some of your own personal story here, or experiences as it relates to this topic. And I'm curious if you could just share a little bit more about your motivation for doing this work and the passion. Like, what have you seen that may have been some of the maybe the bad or the ugly, and maybe some of the good, that's influenced how you approach this work?
Sure. 20 years of experience in the nonprofit and international NGO sector also. Really working closely with executives and often filling the interim executive or the chief executive or executive director role for several different organizations over time. And, there's just been a culture, both in the for-profit and nonprofit sector, of not disclosing pay or compensation information up front. And, that as a hiring manager or as a person that was advising a board of directors to hire their next executive, what I have seen time and again is that when we don't supply that information up front, that we end up several interviews down the road where we might even be flying people in to a city who are coming from a very different cost of living, and who at that point, when they finally feel bold enough to either ask or the organization itself finally discloses what the compensation range is, they frequently pull themselves out of the running at that point. And we're in a position, I have absolutely been in this situation, where we are literally in the position of having to let go of a finalist or the finalist at that point without really a solid, confident backup person. And then we're starting the process all over. And we're talking about, the hourly, the hourly amount of money if you start adding board members, their volunteer hours, staff hours, around hiring manager hours, like all of these folks are spending so much time on this process. That cost, like that real cost to an organization, is pretty enormous when you start actually penciling out the math. So that's one reason that we're, that I've seen in the nonprofit sector in particular. On the flip side, I'll say the number of arguments I've heard against transparency about this information has been really interesting. And in the nonprofit sector, it's most often like we're going to sell them on passion first, and then tell them about this not great salary, and then because they're already so enrolled that they'll just go ahead and take it. Mm-hmm. I've never seen that long game of that posture or mentality has never paid off. It never starts the relationship off on the right foot. It never, convincing someone to take a job, especially a senior executive position, is just never going to work out the way you want it to. And so, my advice is you either need to adjust to be able to bring your salaries up to attract the kind of candidates that you want willingly to take that in for that position. Or you need to understand that you've got to, be able to essentially work with the candidates that can work with that amount of money. And the more upfront you are about that at the beginning, the more likely you are to attract the candidate that can work within that amount of money. So there just aren't unicorns. There are unicorns. I do believe in unicorns.
Yes.
But the unicorn, the purple squirrel, as it's called, in the for-profit sector too, these people, in my opinion, just actually don't really exist. We all have that purple squirrel in us, or that magic unicorn. And I think that part of that is creating a culture in an organization to help bring that part out in us, not to expect that to show up at the front door, and that's what we're willing to pay extra money for, or somehow persuade to take the position.
Yeah, and it goes back to just starting off on the right foot. And as you said, with transparency comes the truthfulness, the openness, the honesty. It's sending the signal, we want you to be here. We recognize your talent, and we recognize, compensation is just a piece of recognizing someone's worth, but doing the best to kind of align with that person's worth as they are good for the organization. So, oftentimes compensation is linked to performance, which research demonstrates is highly subjective, as managers and coworkers are those that inform and evaluate a worker and employee's performance. And if people are making these decisions, we know that, like all of us, we carry unconscious biases that can reinforce wage gaps between marginalized groups. So given your expertise, are there, and in the work that you're doing, are there promising alternatives to performance-based pay that we might consider as we imagine the future of work and how fair compensation plans could be structured? Anything like through the work that you've been doing, or how you advise different organizations to consider, when you get a good employee and as they advance in the organization, how do you honor their good work and compensate them fairly with similar jobs and folks in similar positions?
Sure. There's nothing I advocate more for than clear compensation structures, which can be frankly provided to an employee before they're even hired, or a prospective employee, for them to be crystal clear on what's going to be expected from them, the goals, the milestones, that sort of thing. So we call it performance, but really it's about moving forward the goals, right, that are tied to the outcomes that the organizations are trying to achieve. And so, we can depersonalize that, I think, in a much bigger way than we often do, and really look at it in terms of objectives and outcomes and actual real productivity measures. And then we tie that back to, and then we can connect that also to experience and numbers of years that a person's within an organization, what they may be bringing from their past forward in terms of real life experience, as well as potentially education or other opportunities. An organization gets to decide those things, like what they value and what they want to connect to their compensation structure. And so that to me is something that organizations frequently don't refine or keep evolving simply because of time, especially in the nonprofit sector, right? Like there's just not enough time. We've got to save the people, the kittens, the whatever it is that they're working on, it's very real. I mean, I spent 2 decades in that sector, and
yes.
When you're like, should I work on some HR compensation structures right now, or should I go deal with the reality that these kids, these foster children, don't have a home to sleep in tonight?
Yep.
And so balancing that is really difficult. I fully honor that. And at the same time, at some point you have to make a commitment to put these systems in place, or you end up with so many other messes down the road, and challenges and issues and even lawsuits at times, that then absorb your resources and your time in a totally different way that I think is exponentially higher than what it would have taken to put those compensation structures in place first.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And does that go then to, I'm kind of thinking about onboarding someone new when you're talking about, compensation transparency, also kind of linking how, as you advance in the organization, how that works. I mean, is that something that you recommend for kind of the ideal employers that you work with on thinking more holistically about how you do this from the beginning, from the front end?
Yeah, absolutely. From the front end, but I'll also say it's a solution, in my opinion, for an organization that has been around, like let's say a giant corporation that you may well be familiar with, that has been around for several decades or more, and has not had those clear compensation structures in place. Now has people all over the place in the company, which might be international, making different amounts of money for the same job. And if you put it all down on paper, it probably looks like it's out of balance according to gender, or maybe for some other reasons. And so what do we do now, right? Like, how do we be transparent suddenly with this and not blow the entire organization up where everybody wants to quit? So my answer to that is that this is going to take time. So no one's expecting you to like just flip the switch on this. But there needs to be a transparent commitment. And that looks like going back, I think, and putting in some very clear compensation structures, as well as professional development and professional advancement plans for folks that are in the organization. So if you have a retail worker making $15 an hour behind the cash register, and in that same organization you have a senior vice president making $150,000 or $250,000 annual salary, plus all sorts of stock options and other benefits, right? That disparity is enormous. And so I think a lot of organizations think, well, that $15 an hour retail worker doesn't actually know what the senior vice president makes, and it's better that way because it would be so upsetting for them. I completely disagree. First of all, they already have a pretty good idea, I think, of what that person's making. The veil of secrecy around it just makes it worse. So for me, what I want to see organizations have in place is that if that person who's working as a retail associate says, I'm a little bit blown away by how much you can make as a senior vice president in this company, and I'd like to get there one day. That there can be someone in the HR communication area who says, I got your back on that. So let me tell you, it might take you 5 to 10 years to get from where you are right now there, but here's the path. And I'm going to walk alongside you and cheer for you and support you. It might mean you need to go back to school if there's a degree requirement for some reason. It might mean you need to get this kind of experience, or there might not also be an opening in that realm for a very long time. So we want to set some realistic expectations here too. But we got you on this. If that's where you want to go, we're with you. And so I see a lot of, especially nonprofit organizations, go at this like, let's just try to shrink the disparity. Let's bring the executive salaries way down, and we'll bring some of the hourly employees up, and then somehow we'll all be closer here in the middle. And I don't actually think that's the answer. I think that we need to find a way, yes, to regulate disparities that are too enormous, But at the end of the day, like find a real path, like help support folks in getting where they want to go within an organization.
Yeah, I really like that, the way that you frame that, because it kind of goes into this concept of possibility models, seeing it to be it, and having a more clear path rather than what if you're lucky enough to get mentorship or sponsorship in a larger organization, you may have someone who is a kind mentor, a kind sponsor to say, here's how I figured it out. Talk to this person and this person and this person to map out that path, like how, as you described it, to get more training or education or whatnot to advance within the organization. So there are some benefits to it. And also kind of, as you've described, not going the other direction where you're kind of changing compensation structures for people that have put in their time or have earned their stripes, and then you kind of create this zero sum game, or a kind of a scarcity mindset where in order to be fair, everyone has to lose, right? Like
Right.
And that just creates more fear. And that kind of links to this next question that I have for you. And so I want to share this graph, this visual with you. And this actually comes from research from World at Work, the 2019 Compensation Programs and Practice Survey. Can you see that?
I can.
Okay, cool. Awesome. All right. This is very high tech.
Sure.
Okay, so in this study, the research finds that even when compensation specialists advise that transparency is needed to convince employees that they're fairly paid, a growing number of employers have pulled back on providing employees with broad-based information about, and this is just kind of pay transparency here, within their organization. So, this is more of a, let's just kind of guess here, but, why do you suspect employers are ignoring what experts agree is good for business and good for employees to feel a sense of purpose, meaning, and belonging on the job? So it probably links to kind of fears, worries, or concerns that may be unfounded. But I mean, when you look at this graph, and we'll share this with resources after the call, but the actual pay levels for all employees that are shared, it's below 10%. So it's this bottom kind of black line, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And, there's different degrees of pay transparency depending on positions, but for all positions, it's totally at the bottom here. So what's going on? Like what is the fear of employers for just doing what, I know this kind of having worked in kind of a public organization where all salaries, if you just Googled them, you could find them in New York City online. And yet,
sure.
But it was still not shared as kind of like, this is our value of compensation transparency. You had to dig a little bit. So what is going on?
Right. I mean, we require this of the public sector, right? And then the top, employees in any nonprofit organization need to be disclosed on their 1099s and that sort of thing. So in certain sectors, we have actually a requirement for this transparency. And then there's, the state of California is also making really some bold moves in this area, where, if you as a job seeker actually ask for the salary range, they're now by law required to give it to you in any sector.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't know that yet. But so this is the work, though, Rhodes, right, is that we have, and you can think of all sorts of other social justice issues around this. I mean, we can go back to the civil rights movement, the gay rights movement, the women's rights movement, women's right to vote. Like, these are all really powerful examples, I think, of something very similar we're trying to do, right? We're trying to change culture in a very significant way that is very uncomfortable because of how the systems were set up before and how they were controlled and how they benefited a certain group of people. Yeah. And so we have like really enormous organizations and companies out there that exist right now with decades and decades and decades of practices that have created so much disparity and so many issues within their organization that they simply just can't move to transparency easily. And so they come up with other arguments to try to to affirm that decision to stay not transparent. And I get it. There are some real arguments that, like there are for any change that we're trying to seek in the world. There's always going to be arguments against this. But at the end of the day, we're talking about something now that research has proven is causing discrimination, is causing wage gaps within organizations, is really having an impact on our ability to diversify our work teams. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, the dots are connected at this point, and now we just have to be brave enough to try to make some of these changes and hope that we can do them in such a thoughtful way that we can move forward. But at the end of the day, like, all of this comes back to the market, right? We live in a very capitalist society that is very driven by money and bottom lines. We have an economy in some ways that is thriving, and there is a lot of opportunity. And the more opportunity that there is, frankly, the easier it is for especially for for-profit organizations to say, we're going to do this however we want to do this. We have more than enough people applying for these jobs. So if you need to know the salary or your compensation, that's fine, but we don't feel like sharing it, so we're going to move on. Yeah. And so that's where the rest of us, I think, have to get behind this and keep showing the evidence, actually arguing with these companies that they'd actually have stronger companies, they'd have less lawsuits, they'd have a lot of money saved in their HR departments if they start working towards some of these goals. And it's also just the right thing to do from a moral perspective too. Yes. Right. So if you actually care about inclusion, if you actually care about pay equity, if you actually care about diverse teams, you can't ignore this piece. It's just too intrinsically connected at this point.
Agreed. So on the point, where these fears, worries, or concerns pop up, I want to do a little framing of what some of these kind of common cases against pay transparency are. And this actually comes from an article in the Harvard Business Review in 2016. So for folks watching, you'll be able to access where this comes from. But in this article that we'll share, it states, far from a panacea, pay transparency is a double-edged sword, capable of doing as much or more damage as good. Broadcasting pay is as likely to demoralize as it is to motivate. While pay transparency may accelerate attention being paid to remedying pay discrimination, managers should consider moves towards transparency with their eyes wide open. And then they go on to say that pay transparency has 3 costly responses. The first is that employees who suddenly discover that they are underpaid become more dissatisfied with their employer and more likely to depart. The second is that employees reduce their productivity when consistently reminded of what they perceive as unfair rewards. And then the last kind of argument against this is employees suddenly are made aware of their peers' high pay may take up politicking for change. So my question for you, Rebecca, is that for those of us who are DEI champions advocating for compensation transparency because it's advancing our broader inclusion goals, what words of advice would you offer these folks, all of us, to help counterbalance some of these concerns that the leadership team may likely bring up to push back against this kind of rising pressure to be more transparent with compensation?
Yeah, I mean, of course, I've read that article. And, right. It's one in a sea of articles that say the opposite. So I know it's Harvard, but Harvard. I think it's just a one-dimensional look at this problem. Yep. And so, yes, the organization that's going to suffer the employee who is suddenly so disgruntled because now they know what everyone else is making in the organization, well, that company clearly didn't do anything to work into that conversation, right? Mm-hmm. So it's a bigger conversation. And I agree. I would never advocate for, especially a large company with a long history of potential disparities and issues that might get suddenly revealed with a suddenly transparent pay transparency value. I would never advocate for that to just do it and see what happens. Not a good idea. Right. But then it's not a value, right? Then it's just an idea. It's just something that I don't know why you're doing it, because there's outside external pressure or there's pressure internally from your employees to suddenly be transparent. But I truly believe if you install transparency around your culture, around pay, around compensation, around your values, as a value in an organization, something that you look at every day in your organization in different ways, something that your board of directors holds up high, that your leadership teams walk the talk around, I don't actually think you're going to run into those issues in the way that we like to feel like we might be, that might occur, right? Like that's fear talking, and walking the talk and congruently employing and instituting and actualizing and operationalizing your values. That is the antidote to fear. It's the antidote to the things you're talking about in that article. So articles like that, frankly, bum me out because I feel like it just gives all these organizations or companies like an excuse to like shelve this one more day.
Yes.
And I don't we don't have another day. Like, let's get this right.
And I love your response to that, because there are many folks that are watching right now who may have brought this up. They may be chief diversity officers. They're talking about just, this is another way of building a more inclusive organization, and the CEO may have read that article and like has baked in talking points to push back against it. So your response to that, I think, is really helpful for many of us who have to have those difficult conversations and have to remind the leadership team, like, these are our stated values, and on Prosper City's website, you have this amazing pledge, right? That if you don't have values around this, you should definitely check out that pledge, because it helps you in crafting what your values are when it comes to compensating workers that are really good for your organization. So I think that's.
And I think, at the end of the day, I'm also a realist about this. The truth is that we're only going to be able to change so much, I think, from like this sort of grassroots. Here we are starting our own startups, building platforms. We're social change activists. At the end of the day, I do think that what is going to create this ripple effect of this steamroll of change in culture, where we might actually see 10 years, 20 years from now, however long it takes, where every organization is just like, of course we have with the salary information and compensation information in the job description. I mean, that's either the law, or that's now, or that's just how we do it, in the same way we put the description of the job duties in every job description. Like, part of how we're going to see that is by organizations and companies, and large influential ones in our society, making that leap and then putting pressure on their competitors and their peers in the fields to do the same thing. Mm-hmm. So I'm not kidding myself, for sure. Like, we drive, these companies are going to drive each other. Under Armour is going to drive Nike, and Adidas, right? Like, they like to do what each other does. So we got to, try to target and find one organization that's brave enough in each of those industries, right? And help them, provide the support, provide the coaching to be able, and it might take a couple of years for organizations of that size to get where they want to go, and then to turn to their neighbors and be like, we got this, what's going on with you? So right, there are organizations out there like Buffer Technologies is a social media platform, and they from day one started their company. Their salaries are posted with the person's name next to them. Right, are posted. That's a level of transparency not everyone needs to go to, certainly, but that's pretty bold. And they're very clear about how they split up equity, right, in stock, and what it takes to earn that. Their compensation structures are very clear. I've had the opportunity to talk to one of the vice presidents over at Kiva.org, a large nonprofit organization that's got a great reputation. And they're working toward greater transparency in terms of posting jobs, but they have a fantastic compensation structure running in the background. That's very, as far as I understand anyway, that's very open and available to employees. So everybody knows where they start, where they can go, and how to get there.
Yeah.
And that list is getting longer and longer, and they're big names. So that are moving in this direction. I mean, Intel's got a lot of transparency practices and values around that are being operationalized also. And so the more these big organizations can get behind it, the more we're going to see everybody across the country, hopefully, really moving in this direction.
Yeah. And I love that you gave those examples, and I kind of want to build off of where you're going, but just to kind of frame it. So going back to these talking points, I'll call them the fear talking points. It centers around departures, reduced efforts, and active politicking within the organization. Like, these things could happen, right? And these behaviors definitely spark change. They're behaviors that I think any employer, if that behavior were to happen, like even kind of reduced efforts because of a maybe less intentional way of showing compensation transparency, it still drives them to make changes, right? Like like employers like Buffer that you just gave that example, who want to be more proactive, they see the value of compensation transparency. They don't want to get into the position where employees are leaving because they realize, wow, I've been working in this job for 15 years and I just realized that my colleague who's in the same position is getting paid triple what I'm getting paid, right? Like, what can they do to be more proactive? So the Buffer example is everybody is kind of, it's clear from day one, like,
Right.
here's what you get paid. It's next to your name on our website. Here's what it takes to earn equity so that you own part of this company. What are some other examples?
Well, I mean, Buffer's in a great position intelligently of their own doing to start on day one, right? And they've also, I think, I mean, their blog and their resource hub on their website is extraordinary. People are often like, where do I got to learn more about how to be this transparent or compensation structures or how this all works? I'm like, oh, check out Buffer's site. It's really an incredible place. And yet they also talk about how it doesn't solve all the problems, right? It's not a perfect sum game. We be transparent and now suddenly we don't have any issues in our organization. There still will be certainly some issues because people are people. And compensation is complicated, and performance and being able to subjectively or objectively, I should say, review goals and the people behind achieving those goals. So there's always those sorts of challenges. For me, the much bigger question is how do you address these sorts of things when you know that these issues already exist in an organization? So how do you suddenly become more transparent about these things and take some really proactive steps? And I think we also have to start looking out for examples of that happening, because they are happening. I would need to refresh myself on the greater details of what Salesforce did, right? But there's an organization, as I understand it, if I recollect it correctly, is that they realized after doing an enormous assessment of their organization and pay that there were disparities and inequities and some issues within the organization, and they were largely around gender. And so, as I understand it, they took a great amount of money and tried to basically bring people up and basically get everybody where they needed to go. And it cost them millions, maybe billions of dollars to basically write that, and a lot of time to go through and assess the structure and look at where everyone was at. And you're talking about an organization with so many employees. So, they have the resources to do that, and they did it. So high applause for that. There are certainly going to be other organizations that don't have that kind of resource, like, oh, wow, we have a $1.2 million disparity issue here that we need to fix somehow, and we don't have that cash, especially if we're a nonprofit, to suddenly fix that. So, my advice then is to say, this is where, I have despite me being a consultant, I have a lukewarm feeling about consultants sometimes, but they're really important at times, like when they have an expertise in a very specific field, where your HR person, or if you don't have an HR person, which a lot of organizations don't, you don't have that internal expertise yet. This is a great time to bring someone in, to have someone assess your organization around the larger concepts or values related to inclusion and belonging, or around something very specific like compensation. So there are people like me, there are people that have whole organizations and firms that focus on these issues right now. Is it an investment? Of course, but you can plan for that investment, and you can also do the math on what happens if you don't invest in this money down the road, and see that it's going to be a more economical, more intelligent, fairer, juster approach to actually address this issue now, and to bring in some outside expertise to help you. Like, you don't have to do this alone is the thing, right? And sometimes, especially around money, having that third party who's objective, who's not attached, who doesn't have a salary that they're drawing from your organization, who doesn't know the board members as their friends or the leadership, and they can really just step in and say, this is what I see, and let's just design a plan to figure our way forward. And we'll even work on the messaging for you, right? Like, because this might, with you, like this might take a year or more to kind of get where we need to go. So let's sit down with the retail workers. Let's sit down with the different folks that are working in different departments in your organization, and just like, let's have those real honest conversations with them. Yeah. 9 out of 10, maybe 10 out of 10. I feel like employees really respect that level of honesty if it's coming from a real place, right? A genuine place, not we have to fix this because otherwise we're all going to jail. But we have to fix this because we actually care. We just didn't realize how like compensation and us not talking more openly about this really has created a lot of the inequities in the organization. We get it now, and we want to work on it, and we want you to work on it with us. Like, we want you to have a voice at the table around it, and let's make this right. I mean, what employees don't want that message coming from their leadership team?
Yeah, and to kind of on the topic of transparency, being transparent about the process, right? So if you aren't as lucky as Buffer from day one to think about this, your organization, you've inherited a lot of these systems and the culture. It's been around for 50, 100 years. What can you do right now? And maybe it's a more incremental approach, but you're being transparent about the process to right that ship, right? And so I think that's really helpful. And if you don't have the internal expertise, yes, that's where the value of consultants can really improve your return on investment if you are being proactive in that way. So earlier on, you were talking about I always call it the concept of frenemies, like people in the same space. So like a Google and a Facebook and Apple. If one of those companies said, this is in alignment with our diversity, equity, and inclusion commitments, we are doing it. Chances are the others may decide to kind of follow, but may not, right? So you had mentioned different movements and legislation, like when talking about the Civil Rights Movement, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, really important legislation that did have an impact on the workplace. From your perspective, does government intervention help with closing existing compensation gaps? Like, I know in your city, in San Francisco and New York City, they just passed laws preventing employers from asking applicants about their salary histories, right? So what are your thoughts on this? Is it helpful? Is it not? Does it cause employers just to kind of dig in and resist these kind of changes?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question, and tough to answer. Personally, I still think we live in the Wild West here in America still, and we've got enormous disparities all over the place in so many different fields and sectors. And I ultimately feel like our conscience is not driving us all the time in as many ways as we need it to, so that the law protections at the end of the day are actually really important. And the only reason that you're going to disclose a salary range or no longer ask for information that might enable you to be discriminatory, if the law is helpful or at some point required for that, then I say let's put it in place. We're all driven by different things at the end of the day. And I'm not naive to know that there's just a lot of folks still really ultimately driven by money. A lot of people with a lot of privilege and very powerful positions still. And sometimes the law needs to be the checks and balances if a person's personal values don't allow for that. And sometimes it's the thing, right, that an organization, after many, many decades of being run by a certain group of people, it also gives that vice president instead of the president or the HR director, it gives them, they may be fully behind more transparency or more ethical hiring practices, but they don't ultimately have the final decision-making power, right? To be able to enforce those things within the organization. But now we have this law, right? Which is great. So, and, thank goodness for job seekers too, because I counsel job seekers all day long about, you can very gently, very professionally ask an employer for some information about compensation up front if you want. They might not be legally obligated to give it to you in the way that they are in California now, but they might be willing to give it to you anyway. And 9 out of 10 job seekers say to me they would never be bold enough to ask for that information upfront because they feel like it would tarnish their application, that the employer would suddenly think that all they really care about is money. Mm-hmm. And I think that's such a bummer because that just slows their process down. It slows the organization, the hiring manager's process down. And it, again, it's a game, and I just don't think it needs to be a game. And I want job seekers and prospective employees to feel more empowered as they're walking into an organization. And I just think compensation is piece of that. It's just a very privileged posture, I think, to say that money just shouldn't matter that much when it comes to your job. And that's crazy. I mean, we live in such we have expensive cities. This is an expensive country overall. It's absolutely ridiculous to think that somebody can just choose to work for a job without being concerned about the money. It doesn't have to only be about the money, but it can't not be about the money. People have families, they have obligations, people are caring for parents, people have health issues that they're caring for on the side. There's all kinds of things that are happening in people's lives that we don't know about. So if you want to, be empathetic or like really appreciate the potential of the whole employee and bringing their whole selves to work, you have to also assume that there are all kinds of things happening in the background that you don't know about. And to be truly, I think, equitable and to be truly inclusive, to help people feel like they belong, you don't actually need that data, but because that can be private for a lot of people, and I think it should be, but you can assume that people might have things going on in the background that you don't know about, and that that salary attached to that position does matter. And I think that we can be a lot more respectful to people and all the things that we're dealing with in our lives by just being transparent about that point. And then you can take it off the table. Now we can just talk about passion, right? This is what we're paying. You showed up, you applied for this job knowing what we pay. Awesome. Let's talk about why you want to work here now for real.
Yeah, where are we going together?
Right.
Yeah.
Skip that piece.
Yeah. And I think that speaks to, we see organizations start offices of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the piece on equity, I feel like in the space, we can do so much more around defining what that means. And I think this topic in particular, as we look to the future of this field and the future of work broadly, is getting clear on where compensation transparency fits in terms of meeting people where they're at, making sure that in order for them to feel a sense of belonging, it's considering that unique person or employee in the situation and, how to take care of them, so that they want to continue kind of envisioning, that leveraging their passion to kind of move the mission of the organization closer to accomplishing all the goals that they want to achieve. Right. So I really appreciate that response. Just a few more questions for you before we wrap up. And this is more kind of like some concrete strategies. So, what might be 2 to 3 compensation strategies that the folks who are viewing today and other change makers that they may know can take to attract and retain the best and brightest talent and sustain company growth?
Sure. I mean, the first and foremost to me is the whatever you're putting first out to the job seeker community. So that looks like a job description, of course, having your website speak more to your values and your hiring practices. Also, the more information you can provide to people upfront, the better. So it's always interesting to me how I see people have very strong values, even around compensation and around other things related to their culture, when we meet and talk about it. And then I go to their website and I'm like, well, none of that's anywhere on your materials or your websites, or your job descriptions are super vague and don't talk about your company or the culture. There's definitely, especially as we have this whole group of millennials growing up, right? There's a changing culture about what job seekers want out there. And they want, it's not just about meaningful work. It's about having quality of life. It's about doing things differently. It's about having workplace cultures that are very inclusive, where we aren't worrying about things related to discrimination or gender or there's just really, I think, a call at this point out for more inclusive organizations where everyone belongs and where we don't even have to talk about this stuff because it's just fair and equitable. And so the more you can, I think, sing to that in your job descriptions in particular, there's software that exists like Text.io that you can actually upload your job description and the software will read it. It'll look for words that are tend to be more dominant male words or female words that aren't very inclusive, that don't really resonate with your values. It'll highlight them in different colors. It'll give you alternative suggestions. So if you don't want to hire a consultant to review your things, but actually just want to use some of this really fantastic software that's being developed out there, that's certainly one very clear option that you can do. And then, I think at some point, I think that the first great step for if you decide that you want to start publicly talking about the salary or salary range and the compensation in your job description, so in all your advertising that you start putting up online, it's a bold first step that not every organization can make quickly. However, I think that if you're in an organization where you're not too worried about the disparities, I think that might exist already, that you can make a decision to start doing that. But what I would suggest is that somebody from each part of your organization, and I mean from your board of directors to your senior leadership team, to your middle management, to your entry level, to your retail workers, if you have a pizza delivery person on your team, like to have them, a representative from every part of your organization, not just your HR team and not just your senior leadership team, sit down at a table together and say, we're thinking about like embodying, operationalizing more values around transparency here. And we believe that compensation and pay actually fits into that category. So, and we'd like to make some new decisions and some new actions around these sorts of things. Let's talk it out together. And then in that space, of course, to make sure that you are also creating a place where your pizza delivery person and your senior vice president feel like they can both talk out loud in this meeting too, right? Like that's another thing to look at in terms of inclusion. So, and then, what I have found is that if you have enough different voices at the table from enough different parts of your organization, that's a big deal. You actually get the information you really need to be able to make that change then. But you also have immediate enrollment, right? So now that pizza delivery person or the bike mechanic or the cash register at the grocery store person is going to go back to their team, right? And they can even be empowered to actually be the spokesperson back with their team and their peers to talk about why this change is happening and where it's coming from and how we can support it together.
Yeah. Those are great strategies, and we'll definitely include pieces of those in some of the workbooks that we develop after our conversation. I really appreciate that. Really concrete. I think many of them folks can do, right? It takes some of the abstract nature of what are we talking about around compensation transparency and just making it more actionable. So I appreciate that. As we wrap up this conversation, what's one thing about the future of work and compensation transparency that we haven't yet discussed that you feel strongly participants should know that they may not know right now?
Well, I feel in compensation transparency, I feel really strongly that we're moving in this direction. Yeah. So that we are going to move toward a more transparent culture, that we're going to continue to look at ways for organizations to be more inclusive, that there are generations of folks entering the workforce right now that have greater opportunity, more education, that have more resources, that are essentially very fortunate to live a higher quality of life, and they're going to continue to be more demanding on the organizations where they work. Like they're really getting that where they spend 40, 50, 60 hours a week of their life matters. Yeah. And so I think that if companies and organizations want to actually continue to evolve and develop and be productive and be successful in the work that they're doing in the world, they're going to have to adapt. The call is clear to me. With the harder part is figuring out how, as an organization, especially if you've been around for a very long time, maybe even a century, how do you make those shifts given how complex your organization is at this point. So yeah, the future to me is transparent. Let's just call it clear.
Yeah.
And it's truth. Like I really do think that we're gonna continue to see a culture of where truth matters. Truth is connected to personal and institutional freedom,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't think that we can have one without the other for too much longer. And so let's just get to work on it.
Yeah, that is the platinum lining. I love that. I love the positive spin at the end of this conversation. Um, so that makes me feel hopeful about where we're going, and I really appreciate your time, Rebecca. Before we close, where's the best place where participants of today's conversation can learn more about you and the amazing work that you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we are Prosper City. So we are a very new organization committed to working on these issues in a bunch of different ways. So you can reach us at www.prospercity.org. We are a social venture for-profit, but with a social justice heart. And
Yeah.
so we've got the .org there. And so you can reach out to me at hello or Rebecca, Rebecca, at prospercity.org.
Excellent. Yes. And we'll include that with all of the great content that comes out of today's conversation. So thank you again. And for everyone tuning in, thank you so much for joining us. Please don't forget that if you want more time with these talks, if you'd like additional resources for doing this work in your organizations, and if you'd like to join our community calls after the summit, you can check out your options for getting extended access to all of the sessions and other helpful goodies using the link below. And for every purchase that you make, it helps me pay for amazing speakers like Rebecca and all of the generosity, wisdom, and labor that so many of our speakers are giving to help us grow the belonging movement. So thank you, and thanks again to today's featured belonging champion, Rebecca Channer. Take care.
Thanks.